Have you ever found yourself doom scrolling ArtStation just wishing that you could make these awesome characters, but you just can't make that plunge? You open Blender and it's just an empty void, speaking to you from beyond the ether. No, it's okay, we've all been here. So how about we forget about this and we focus in this video on the workflow of creating a character, as well as some tips and tricks which might help you stay motivated. And hopefully by the end you'll feel comfortable enough to make characters like this one. Now first we need to pick a style that we want to use for our character. So we can look at ArtStation for styles that we might like. Now be careful, we don't want to set our expectations to make something to the level as some great piece on ArtStation. That's just not realistic. We need to adjust our expectations, but we need to pick kind of a design that we want to aim for. Now, once we've adjusted our expectations, we can decide on what our goal is going to be. What's the end goal? What kind of character do we want to create? And especially when starting out, we need to pick something quite simple, something that's not too complicated. So in this case, I have picked an astronaut in space that happens to be a frog. Now, before I start faffing about within Blender, what we first need to set up is some image references. These are very useful to have on hand so we can compare our work and make sure we stay on track. Now, there's several ways of doing this. One of them is just to drag open a window over here and then turning this into the image editor and then just dragging our concept into this image editor. Now this works fine, we now have our concept here, but we're limited to just one image. Now another option is to drag the reference right into our 3D scene. This will now create an empty with the image right within our 3D viewport, and we can also adjust the rotation and location of this concept. Now as you can imagine, having the concept right here in the viewport has a ton of benefits. And we can drag in multiple images and all have them in the 3D space. We can also adjust the settings for these images so they render in different ways. For example, they can be in front of everything or behind everything, and we can also adjust the opacity. Now, as you can imagine, this is very useful, but at the same time, these images now can easily get in the way of what we're doing. So instead of using the image editor or using these empties, what I like to use is PureRev. Now, PureRev is used by many artists as it's free and it's very useful. We can move the images around and we can also just work in Blender without losing our reference. So let's bring on our space frog concept here. We can adjust the size of PureRev here as well. And then we can work inside Blender, and if the reference is in the way, we can just simply move the box around with the right click on the mouse. So as you can see, this is very versatile and very easy to use, and I highly recommend it for your image references. Right, so now you've got your references, you've set your goal, you get everything ready, and now you have to start actually making the character. And this is where a lot of us get stuck as we don't know where to start. Now, what we can do to kind of jumpstart our project is use base meshes, and we got some free ones from the Blender Studio. And these are really useful as they really help us to get started and have a visual starting point instead of having to start from scratch. And over time, as you do more projects, you can start creating your own base meshes for your own projects as well. Now, for Space Frog, I'm just going to use the primitive stylized base mesh here. And as I drag this in, I need to make sure that it's not set to instanced. You can see this by this empty over here. So I'm going to disable instances, so it's going to be an actual object. I'm going to set the locations as well to 0, just so that the base mesh is at the center of our scene. Right, so now we have our base mesh. So I'm going to bring back our reference here. I'm just going to put it in the top corner here. And what we're going to do is try and create the proportions of the space frog with this base mesh. Now I'm going to start off first by deleting parts of the model that I'm not going to use, since we're not going to have a human. We don't need any of these human face features. So I'm just going to delete everything but the actual head. So now that we're just left with the head and the body, we are still left with a human looking figure. So what we're going to do is adjust the individual elements of our base mesh here to fit the silhouette and style of our frogman. So over here in sculpt mode, we can use the grab brush just to adjust the shape and silhouette of all of these individual parts. And if we want to swap to a different element, we just have to press Alt-Q while hovering over it to swap to this other object. Now, as I'm adjusting the base mesh here, I'm also looking at real references of real frogs to kind of get in that frogginess look, so it doesn't look just like a man with a frog head. So it's just like a frog. We have a big chest. It's also extremely wide. Also made the character look a lot shorter, and I've also spaced out the legs and arms a bit further just to make it look more like a frog instead of a human. So now that we got the body in place, let's have a look at this head here. So I want to turn this head into something more like a frog. So I think we can use this opening here as the mouth area. So we can use the grab brush just to drag this down and create the shape for the mouth. So we're just going to adjust the shape here to fit the concept here. We're just looking for the silhouette shape. We're not going to add any details. We're not going to do anything fancy. We're just going to look for the overall silhouette and the base shape here. Now, if we lack any shapes, we can always add in new primitives. So for example, for the eyes, I'm going to add in some spheres to create the shape for the eyes. Again, we just want to use very simple shapes at the start here so that we can just focus on the silhouette. Now, we can go into edit mode to make small changes to the geometry, like for example, these nostrils, but in general, we want to stick to these big, simple shapes. And I'd recommend you spend a bit of time here just to play around with these very simple shapes, as you don't have to worry about destroying the detail you've sculpted in already. So just getting focused on these big shapes, finding out what looks appealing and what doesn't, what does look like your character and what doesn't. All of this is very useful at this early stage, so get comfortable and just play around. Now, this is kind of a small tip, but if your character has a lot of different elements, I would recommend giving them different materials within the viewport, just so it's easy to tell which part of the blockout belongs to what. Now, in this case, our character doesn't really have that much complexity to it, but still, I would like to separate the body and the eyes with different colors. So we can go over here to viewport display settings and adjust the color for the frog. So I'm going to set this to a greenish color. Maybe a bit of a dark green color, and we can also adjust the roughness. Now we can quickly share this material to the other objects by pressing Ctrl L to get our link menu. We can then link materials, and all the selected objects will have the same material as the active object. Now for the eyes, we're going to set it to a different material. So let's create a new one here. Let's call them eyes, and let's set this to a black color. And for the roughness, we can set this to a low value so it looks a lot shinier. So just by adding a bit of color, we already start to see the character come through a bit more. This is very handy, especially at the early stages, to kind of get that vibe of the character to show up. So I spent just a bit more time with these base shapes for the body of the frog, and as you can see, it really makes this look more froggy, if that's a word. For example, the fingers and toes, made sure they have the right amount of digits for a frog, and also just adjusted their shape just to really feel froggy. Now, if we spend a bit of time here and we get a good result, this already starts to boost our motivation and also our desire to continue and make this character work. So spend an extra minute in the blockout just to help boost your confidence and boost your motivation to keep going. Now, before I move on to any next step within a character, I always make sure that I have a backup. So in this case, I have created two collections, one with the blockout and one duplicate where we're going to do the sculpting. Now, to use this blockout for sculpting, what we need to do first is right click and convert all of these objects to a mesh. And this will basically apply all of the modifiers for all of these objects within our blockout. And now with this, we can join this together without having to deal with conflicting modifiers. Now I do want to have the eyeballs as separate objects, so I'm going to go into edit mode here, select the eyeballs, and separate these out again. So now that we have the body as a separate object, we can jump into sculpt mode and use the remesher tool to remesh this into a single object. Now to set the voxel size, we can press R here, and as you can see we get this grid, and if we now move the mouse, we can adjust the resolution of these voxels. Now once we've set our voxel size, all we need to do is press the remesh button, and it will remesh the blockout so we can use it for sculpting. Now when sculpting creatures, even if it's not 100% human like this frog, I still like to use anatomy as a reference to kind of ground this creature so it feels more plausible. So I'm trying to think what muscles this creature has and how they would form, and again I'm using just very simple planar references here for the muscle groups just so I can get the overall flow of these forms going and make it really feel like a real creature. Now you might be wondering, Jim, I would really like to learn more about this anatomy stuff and learning how to make a character in more detail. Can you help me? Yes, we can. And here comes the ad. We have made this amazing character course, which goes into detail about all the steps within the creation of a character for animation. So if you're interested in that, please check it out. It actually does help us out quite a lot. Right, so ad over, back to the video. Now, after a few minutes of sculpting, I'm left with more or less something like this. So we got the basic anatomy shapes here. I've also added some bit more fat to the character since it's a fatty frog. And especially around here, around the neck, I've added a lot of this fatty tissue to make it really feel like a frog. Now, since we already had all the base shapes in place thanks to the blockout, this was a lot easier to achieve. And since we didn't have to mess with the silhouette, this is just a lot faster. Now, you might be wondering, why am I doing all of this work on the body when we have clothes that will be covering all of this anyway? Well, this is also just to help me figure out what will be inside the clothes. So if we have a character, for example, which has very tight-fitting trousers or a shirt or a jacket, well, it's very handy to know what kind of surface is below it to make it all feel more natural. Now, in my case, my character is going to have a very wide-fitting astronaut suit, so it won't really make much of a difference, but personally, I still prefer to do this. Now, once we're happy with the body, we can do a block out for the clothes. Now, we can again use the same principles that we use with the body, using very primitive shapes to create the overall silhouette of our clothes and all of our objects. Now, there's another option of first doing the retopology for our character's body. Now, we want to do this for the body anyway, and most often the clothes will follow the same flow and shape as the body, so we can extract some geometry from the body here and use this for our clothes. So it's up to you to decide which approach you want to use. I would still recommend using this extract method as much as possible just to save you on time and unnecessary work. For example, our character here has gloves, so why would I make new geometry when I can simply use the geometry from the hand? Now, obviously, this is a very speedy approach. We can quickly add new parts to our clothing, and obviously this is just a base. From here, we can add more details and change the shape as much as we like. Now, that said, we're not going to escape needing to make custom blockouts for certain parts. For example, with the boots here, I can't use the feet, so I'll just need to make some simple shapes here and create a simple boot blockout. Now, just like with the body, we're going to keep ourselves to just using very simple shapes so we can make easy and quick adjustments to the overall shape and silhouette of our object. Now, by doing this, you'll very quickly find the shape that works for you, and again, this will boost your motivation to continue onwards making this character. Now, this approach is not just limited to the clothes. We can do the same for all of the other objects with our character. For example, my frog here has kind of this battery pack that charges its laser. So what we're going to do here is just simply use very simple shapes, in this case a cube, to kind of get the overall shape of that box in place so we can really see how it will affect the silhouette of our character. So bit by bit, we're going to start adding more and more of these parts, again looking how it affects the silhouette and how it affects the overall shape of our character, and make sure that everything fits nicely together. This is also a good point to try new ideas for the character. Since we're still early on, we can still see how certain changes might affect that silhouette. And in my opinion, this is probably one of the more fun stages to be in, as we can kind of experiment quickly without being worried that we're destroying or redoing too much work. Now, as you're going through this process, you're going to find that you're going to make certain objects that are going to be repeated over and over again. In this case, for example, I got this kind of knob on this power pack, which I imagine could adjust the frequency or whatever for the laser. Now, if I want to have more than one of these, I could just duplicate this over with Shift D and add another one. However, if I decide to make a change to the knob design, I have to do this for each single one of these. Now, nobody's got time for this, so instead what we can do is press Alt D, and this way we'll duplicate it, but now it will be linked. So any changes we make to this object will be same across all of these linked objects. And we can still scale this object down in object mode and it will still be the same. Now, you're gonna run into the point where you accidentally just duplicate something instead of linking them. Now, for example, in this case, this lower knob here is not linked, so it doesn't receive any of the changes. Now, to quickly fix this, all we need to do is to select this, and select another object or another knob here, and then press Ctrl L to relink this. So let's select object data, and this should relink the object. So now I've done most of the base shapes and most of the blockouts here for the character, we can now think about adding more details. And I'm going to start off first with the spacesuit. So for this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to duplicate the suit here. I'm going to go into local space, And the reason I duplicated this is I want to do the sculpting work on a separate object and then later project the result back onto the actual suit. So this basically allows me to be a bit more destructive, a bit more aggressive, sculpting without having to risk destroying the actual suit. Now for this suit, what we're going to do, we're going to use the cloth brushes that we have, which basically simulate a bit the effect of cloth. So for this, what I want to do is add some folds to the legs and arms. Now to get a good result, what I'm first going to do, I'm going to use the grab brush just to extend the length of the fabric. Since I want it to fold on itself, I need to have excess fabric. So I'm just going to stretch this out both for the legs and arms. And now with this all stretched out, we can use this grab brush with the cloth filter to push this back in. And as you can see, as I do this, it starts to fold in on itself. So every time you want to add folds to a character, make sure that you add that extra material so I can actually create these folds. This is also one of the reasons I want to separate this object so I don't feel bad for stretching out the geometry. Now, I like to start off doing this at a very low resolution so we don't add any unneeded noise. We just want to have the big folds first, and then later we can add more resolution and then we can add more of these smaller folds. Now, make sure you keep in mind that you have a body below it, so we can use the grab brush with the cloth filter just to push out some parts of this fabric so it doesn't intersect with the body below. We can also use the cloth brush here to push in certain areas where we have, for example, the belt, to really make it feel like this cloth is interacting with the other objects. Now, once you're happy with the sculpt, you can use a shrink up modifier with the project method to project all of this folds back onto the original suit model. Right, so I've gone ahead and done this for all of the cloth material. So with the suit here, I've inflated it a bit more to make it feel a bit more puffy, like an actual spacesuit. I've done the same here for the gloves, the folds here, as well as for the boots, and all of these secondary cloth materials as well. And just by adding these details, you can see it really brings our character to life, and it wasn't too difficult since we're just using this cloth brush here. And if you look here at the backpack as well, you can see just adding these extra bits of folds really add this interesting look to our character. So again, adding these small changes really make a big impact and also motivate you to keep going. Now, next up, I spent a bit of time doing some UV unwrapping. Now, I'm not going to cover in this video how to do this, and that's a subject for another video, but basically what I've done is made sure that all of these objects have roughly the same size when it comes to textures. This will make things a lot easier later. We want to add some simple textures to this character. Now, next up, what I did is make sure that every part has their own space along the UV tile. So if we go into edit mode for our character, you can see everything is nicely unwrapped, and I've separated these into 3 texture sets. So I've got one for the body, one for the spacesuit, and one for the equipment. Now, one benefit of basically creating these different texture sets is that we can now bake out information that we don't have access to in Eevee. For example, in Eevee, we don't have access to the pointiness value. If we set this to rendered, you can see we just get this gray color. If we go to Cycles, however, we have all of this lovely information that we can use to generate kind of this curvature map that we can then use for our shaders. So what we can now do is kind of get this information in Cycles and bake this to a texture that we can then use back in Eevee. So let's start off first by creating a texture. So here we got an image texture, and let's create a new one, and let's set a resolution. In this case, I'm going to set to 4K, but to be fair, for the pointiness value, we can get away with a lower resolution. Now, we don't need to connect this texture to anything. We just need to make sure that it's the active node within the material editor here. Now, the next thing I need to do is to select the objects that I want to bake with. Now, since I divided the UVs between the collections, I just need to select all the objects within one of these collections. So I'm going to select, for example, I'm going to select all of the objects within the equipment collection. Now, from here, I can scroll down in the render settings here. I'm going to go to the bake tab, and here I'm going to set the bake type to emit. Since we've connected the pointiness value directly to the output node, it converts it into an emission pass. So now this all we need to do is press the bake button, and we'll start to bake all of the pointiness values for all these objects into this new texture. So I'm just gonna let that render out. So bit by bit, we'll start filling in. And once this is done rendering, we can save this as an image. I'm gonna save it as an OpenEXR file so I don't have to deal with color correction. Now, once we've done this for all of our objects, we can bring these textures back into Blender, connect these up, and now if we go into Eevee, you'll see we'll have all this information that we can now use for our shaders. Now, once I sorted out the baking, the next thing I did is set up a simple rig using Rigify. So nothing too crazy, and gave it a simple pose. Now, to keep things simple, instead of rigging every object individually, what I've done is most of these objects have a surface deform modifier, and this modifier allows this object to be deformed by a different object instead of a rig. In this case, it's using the suit rig object. Now that's this object over here, which is basically a low resolution version of the suit, gloves, and boots, all joined together, and then this is being driven by the rig. Now when we move the rig, it deforms this object, which then in turn deforms all the other objects. Now, it's a great way to quickly rig and deform a character. Obviously, it has its downsides as it tends to bend things around a bit, so it's really only useful for certain scenarios, but in this case, we can get away with it. Now, next up, I set up some very simple shaders, and in this case, it's basically just a color, some roughness and metallic values, and then using the pointers that we baked here to overlay on top of a color, just to get kind of this stylized painterly look for our objects. Now for this, I've added some very simple textures as well as a Game Boy for our character to hold, since I thought it would be funny for our frog to hold a Game Boy with Frogger on it. Now as for the textures that I've added, they are very simple, seamless textures just to add, well, a bit of texture to the character. Now adding this little bit of extra texture just helps make things pop just a bit more and make it look a bit more interesting. And we don't have to do anything fancy. For example, with the head here, all I've done here are two different textures of Verneuil just to break up the basic shape of the frog's face. Now next up, I wanted to add an interesting background for the character, so I made this kind of nebulae with stars. Now for the stars, I simply used some Verneuil textures to generate different size stars. So we got big stars, medium stars, and small stars. Now to break this up, I used some noise textures and basically multiplied these on top of each other to create kind of this nebulae look here. And this I can then use again to break up the stars. So at the end, the stars will be spread out differently. Now these stars I want to add back onto the nebulae, and at the end I'm left with something like this, which I think is interesting enough for our character's background. Now to really make my character pop, I've added some strong contrasting lighting here. So I started off with this really strong light coming from the back, from the sun here, that creates this nice interesting rim light, and I also made the background a bit more interesting by adding this star here. Now I also wanted to add a different color light to the side, so I add this green star here, which gives this kind of green hue from the side, which really brings in nice contrast. Now you might notice that the light comes from an angle that doesn't really make sense with the placement of this star here, but I'm only really concerned by what it looks like in the camera, and if we go to the camera view, you can see it doesn't look too bad. Now lastly, I added a few more gradients to the scene just to make the character pop. So I got this gradient right behind the character, and I got this other gradient right behind the moon. This really makes things kind of stand out from the background just a bit more. Now to make these gradients, it's pretty simple. All you need to do is add a gradient texture to a plane and use the object coordinates as an input for the texture. This will make it so that the gradient will radiate from the origin point. Now from here, it's just as simple as adding a color ramp to add some variety to the gradient. And then from here, it's just a simple matter of using this to blend between an emission node and a transparency node. Now from here, we can adjust the color of the gradient by just adjusting the color of the emission node. Now to make this work well with a moving camera, I made sure that these kind of follow the same rotation as the camera. So as the camera rotates, so do these gradients, so they're always behind the objects. So it's a very great way to make sure that the character really stands out from the background. Now, no render would be complete without just a bit of post-processing. Now, to make things a bit lighter, what I've done, I've rendered out some different renders. So I got the main normal render, so we got what we have in the viewport, and I also rendered out all of the gradients. So that's this one over here. And I've brought these two renders into this new blend file just to keep things nice and light. So what did I do here? It looks like a lot, but it really is not too complicated. Over here, all of this is just to add the lens flare effect as well as some ghosts here. So as you can see, it has all of these kind of glowy bits that we can add on top of our image. So we start off first with a simple bloom to add some bloom to our image. And I've also added all these other glare nodes here, which are just ghosts. So if we go over here, you can see these generates just some simple ghosts at different sizes. And what I do with these is either blur them or kind of warp them with the lens distortion node. And these create some really interesting variations. So when we add all of these on top of each other and we add this to the bloom, we get this really bright effect here. Now this is too bright for what I want, so what I did is I got in a lens dirt texture and multiplied this on top of the effect just to tone it down just a bit more. Now after this, I bring in back some of that bloom, and then all of this we can then add on top of our image. So we add this to the render, which we also have color adjusted, and just like that, it looks a lot better. We got these nice glowy effects, but we're not done yet. As you can see, I brought in just a static render here. Now this render is at a lower resolution than the actual render I have in the post-processing here. Now the reason for this way I can kind of crop down the image to a lower size. So if we zoom out here, you can see that the actual render is quite wide. This is on purpose so I can avoid having problems where at the edges of the screen, the post-processing sometimes goes a bit wacky. So we can remove this by cropping that all out. And just like that, we still have all the benefits of the post-processing, but we don't get any of these weird distortions down the edges. Now, the last things I did to the render is add a vignette and a bit of lens distortion. Now to add the vignette, I simply got a white image, blurred it, and then multiplied this on top of the render. And just like that, I've added some interesting post-process effects to the render. Now, since you made it all the way to the end of this video, I take it you are really interested in characters. And well, like I mentioned before, I have this amazing character course I worked on for a long time with the CG Boost team, which covers all the parts of creating a character step by step. So if you're interested in supporting CG Boost as well as the CG Boost team, this is a great way to do so. And while you're at it, we got a ton of other cool courses that you might be interested in. Now, aside from that, we also made available the resources used in this video to download on our website, so check it out as well. Now, without any further ado, take care guys, and see you in the next video.